The Automobile Association of South Africa has criticised government's plan to introduce a zero-tolerance alcohol level for driving. The amendments effectively change the legal blood alcohol content limit for drivers from 0.05 grams per 100 millilitres to 0 grams per 100 millilitres. Now, this week, the association told Parliament the reduction of blood and breath alcohol levels to zero is unlikely to achieve positive change. Well, Layton Beard from the Automobile Association of South Africa joining us now to explain how they feel about all of this. Layton, a very good morning to you. Now, ordinarily one would imagine that the AA would support absolute zero tolerance, a zero alcohol blood level, but you reckon, and you've told Parliament this week, that this is impossible.
Yeah, I think we need to make a clarification, Uveka. You're talking about zero tolerance and zero blood alcohol levels, and they're actually two different things. Zero tolerance is actually what the AA wants. We want to see a zero tolerance approach, and we want to see that enforced very clearly on our roads. What the proposal is to reduce the blood alcohol level from the current 0.05 to 0.00, meaning that if you've had even the slightest drink or bit of alcohol, you will be in contravention of the law and you will be prosecuted. Now, in our view, the problem is that we don't have a zero tolerance at the moment in South Africa, and that enforcement is not being done properly. We are arresting 90,000 people a year for drunk driving, but we're only prosecuting something like 6% of those. So that's where the zero tolerance comes in. Our view, Uveka, is that if you legislate something, you need to have the framework to enforce that and to implement it. And at the moment, currently, legislation without implementation or legislation without enforcement is, in our view, going to amount to nothing.
Well, it does get a bit more complicated, doesn't it, Layton? I mean, we saw, what was it, just over a year ago? Was it last year, the year before, the whole hot cross bun issue where it came into, it was a big talking point about what that does to blood alcohol levels and whatever the contents might be. Things like mouthwash, cough mixture as well. So you've also mentioned things like that. You brought that up again in Parliament. And I would imagine, yes, it's going to be very difficult to police that kind of thing.
It is going to be very difficult to police it. You're talking about gut fermentation syndrome, or what is also known as auto-brewery syndrome, where if you ingest something, your gastrointestinal tract actually converts it into alcohol, and you can be intoxicated without actually drinking alcohol. Now, that's a problem. You use a mouthwash and you do a breath test, and you may have alcohol in your breath, and you will be arrested. You go to church or for a religious activity, you drink wine, communion wine, altar wine. That may also have an impact. Our concern is, Uveka, is that the system at the moment is currently under severe strain. And when I say the system, law enforcement is under-resourced. There are too few traffic law enforcers on our roads. The blood sampling of blood is very, very poor. It takes up to a year to have blood samples received and processed. And then, of course, you've got issues with the prosecution, where the courts are also full. So you take all of those factors into account, and now you say, well, we're going to reduce the blood alcohol level to 0.00. That just means that many, many more people run the risk of actually being arrested. Now, when you've got a strained system, as we have at the moment, and you're arresting maybe double the amount of people because they've got 0.01 blood alcohol in their blood, that just means you're putting extra additional pressure onto that system, and it's not going to cope. Our view is that you need to look at enforcement. You need to get that correct. You need to double the amount of traffic law enforcers. The whole value chain of enforcement needs to work better, from the police to the blood sampling to the courts. That's where the focus must be. Legislation is not going to solve the problem, and I'll bring you back to something we said at very many times before. You can't solve a problem with legislation that requires boots on the ground, and that's exactly the situation we're in at the moment.
Well, policing would be the one aspect in the enforcement of those regulations, like you say, Layton. The other thing would be changing driver behaviour or motorist behaviour. Now, I'm very interested to find out what you've noticed in terms of COVID, in terms of lockdown and the restrictions we faced in terms of alcohol being on the road, curfew. Was that a game changer at all? And what did it show us in terms of driver behaviour and what we can and can't do, or what we're capable of doing, or following the rules?
No, it's a very good question you're asking, Uveka. I think one of the things that we raised in our submission to Parliament is where is the public awareness campaign and where is the education in schools? We've asked for education in schools to begin as young as primary school, where children are educated about rules of the road. When you look at COVID, certainly there's been a reduction on the roads, and I think everybody acknowledges that. When the Minister released the end of year, the festive season fatality results from the 1st of December to the 11th of January, he noted that there was a 10% reduction in fatalities over that period compared to the same period in 2019. But at the same time, we saw a 10% reduction in the number of vehicles on our roads. So the two are correlating with one another. I think we've certainly seen, because of COVID, there are less vehicles on the road. Now, the impact of the alcohol bans obviously had an impact there as well. I think the point that we're making, Uveka, is that we are going to go into a situation where restrictions will eventually be lifted. And we're going to have a zero alcohol law in South Africa. The question that we're raising over and over and over again, how are you changing consumer behavior? How are you changing the antisocial behavior of drinking and driving? And you cannot do that through legislation alone. You can't just tell people they mustn't do something. You need to enforce it. There need to be public awareness campaigns. There needs to be widespread and consistent education. And above all, the value chain in terms of this needs to be improved immensely. It needs to be double, triple, quadrupled. You can't have a law and then not implement it. People simply will just carry on with the same behaviour they've always been.
Well, Layton, while I have you here, on a different issue, but also related to what you were telling Parliament, you have some concerns, as the AA as well, over the new microdot and tracking rules for cars in the country. And how does that relate to the National Road Traffic Amendment Bill or changes being made there?
Yeah, again, very good question. I think the point that we raised is that there's legislation being planned for microdots and for the companies that produce them. And our view is that should be delayed for now. We are concerned that no research was put on the table to basically inform the decision to include microdots in this legislation. So we've basically said, look, give us the research that your amendment is based on, the amendment to regulate microdots. Why are you making this? What is the rationale behind including this in legislation? Give us the reasons. And I think once we've got the reasons and the rationale and the research that is informing that legislation or that proposed amendment to the legislation, we'll be in a better position to actually understand why it's being implemented and brought in, and we'll be in a better position to comment on it. But at the moment, it kind of stands alone in that piece of legislation. We don't know why it's there.
All right, Layton Beard from the Automobile Association, thanks so much for those insights.